Welcome to Start News Global. I'm Jayant Dasgupta. I'm delighted to invite you to this very special roundtable we have today on multi-alignment. And we have a stellar list of panelists with us today. We have Dr. Arpita Anant, an independent researcher who specializes in multilateralism, international relations, foreign policy, and diplomacy. We have Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta. Dr. Dasgupta has been the ambassador permanent representative to the WTO and has also served on the as Secretary Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And then we have Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan from the School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with you, Dr. Anand. How would you define multi-alignment? This seems to be a buzzword in the foreign policy circles. But, if you look at it, you have multilateralism, you have multi-this, multi-that. One phrase I've heard is that it's aligning with issues rather than countries. Would that be a correct assessment?
So the way I understand it, multi-alignment is aligning with a whole range of countries. I'm not saying issues. I think it is alignment with countries. It can happen at a bilateral level or it can happen in multilateral forums. So multilateral is different from multi-alignment, right? And so in that sense, when people say there is a difference between non-alignment and multi-alignment, there is, right? Because non-alignment was about being away from the military blocks of the Cold War era. Right? This, we have decided now that we are not going to be in military alliances, but we are going to align with everybody with whom we have common interests and with whom we feel with relations with countries with which India will benefit. So it is essentially aligning with a whole range of countries. That is multi-alignment in simple terms. I think non-alignment had an element of multi-alignment in it. Because our relationships with the countries of then what was called the third world was a sort of multi-alignment. But we kept away from the power blocks. Right? Now we are saying, okay, though that group of countries is still with us, we've reinvigorated our relationships with them, but we are now going to be with the West as well as the rest. It's other countries. So that's multi-alignment to me.
That's the clearest definition I've heard so far. Dr. Dasgupta, this multi-alignment that we are preaching or practicing or whatever it is, how does it impact us economically? I mean, do we have problems, let's say, as we were talking about oil and other things before, does it actually have an impact economically or is it okay? I mean, it's sort of, you can have multi-aligned economy as well.
Trade by itself is multi-aligned in any case because you can't restrict your exports to a particular country or a group of countries only. You have to expand the ambit of your export destinations as much as possible. And, we are not enjoying at the moment very harmonious relations with China, but we are importing from China the maximum. More than $100 billion worth. And we are also exporting to the US and importing from them. We are at the same time exporting to Maldives. Of course, the only exception in this is Pakistan. Because of various reasons, Pakistan has not given us the most favored nation status, etc. So we broke off relations with them. But trade by itself is a multi-alignment system. You have to have trade relations with as many countries of whichever hue and political ideology there are. You have to trade with countries.
Okay, that's interesting. Dr. Rajagopalan, in international relations, when you're aligning with two sort of people who don't get along with each other, how does one reconcile that? I mean, how if you say that I'm friends with you and I'm friends with you as well, how difficult is it for a country to sort of,
It is very difficult. So, which is why this is not a strategy that is suitable for all countries at all times. And so I would be somewhat skeptical of its utility for India at the present time. It was, as Dr. Anant mentioned, this was somewhat similar to non-alignment that we followed during the Cold War period, which was also a bipolar period. But at that point of time, we could adopt that because we were neither neighbors nor particularly friends nor enemies of either of the polar powers, either the United States or the Soviet Union. So we could pick and choose between them, and we did. And, we did that when the 62 war happened. We went to the United States for help. Subsequently, in 71, we went to the Soviets for help. And we got the best from both sides. We were the largest recipients of American economic assistance. And we, of course, got enormous amount of diplomatic and military support from the Soviet Union. So we got the best of both sides, and we kind of played one off against the other. That is not always possible. For example, that was not possible for countries in Europe because they were very close. They were geographically close to the Soviet Union, and therefore they had to align against the Soviet Union. They couldn't play one off against the other. So to some extent, we are in that situation now. We and China's neighbors are in that situation now because we are neighbors to one of the great powers, one of the polar powers. And so playing one off against the other is not easy in this kind of circumstance because whatever happens, we are going to have adversarial relations with China. There is, especially because we have a dispute, but even otherwise, we would have that kind of a problem. And so if we have that sort of a relationship with China, one of the two major powers, then it's not possible really to align with China against the United States other than on relatively non-important issues. It's very difficult to align with China against the United States. And we are not doing that either. So I think a multi-alignment is possible under some contexts. It is not always possible for all contexts. And I think in the Indian context right now, as not just India, but also for some of the Southeast Asian countries, East Asian countries, for Japan, Korea, they all tried to some extent some form of multi-alignment. Australia, New Zealand, all of these are countries that tried to maintain a trade relations, economic relations with China while also having a political and diplomatic and military relationship with the United States, and they found they couldn't ultimately because that the Chinese, with the proximity of China, China's power, China's behavior, all of that means that it becomes difficult to ride those two horses together. So I think it is, in some senses, one of the problems that we're having is that it's not always easy to do that. And one could also compare that with our neighbors, smaller countries, which can play India off against China, right? But that is possible because it's somewhat easier for them to do that than for us to, because they're not neighbors of China. We are, so it becomes much more difficult for us to play that game. Right?
Dr. Anant, you just explain the meaning, and I think that sort of clears the thing up for me. But we just heard about the difficulties in that. So do you think it is still a workable kind of a policy to have, in the sense that in today's world, so much of friction where there are our world, does it help for you to sort of try and stay neutral and say, I'm friends with it?
Actually, I think it's easier for India at this point of time to be multi-aligned because we are not we are not sitting in the UN Security Council.
Nice.
Where our vote would matter in a very big way. Most times, whenever we are on the council, it's a different way.
Okay.
But my sense is that we are probably in a situation where most countries have a very positive view of India.
Mm-hmm.
It's a country with a lot of opportunities. It's a big market, for everybody. So I think it's something we can talk about very easily now. But I think in the longer run, as you become a bigger power, it gets a bit more difficult in some ways. Trying to, not a bigger power in the sense of become like the US or become like this or that, but at this point of time where you are somewhere rising, not completely there, it's easier for you to maintain that position, is my sense. So in some way, a bit of disagreement there with what Professor Rajesh has said. My sense is that. And I think when you get to a very good, strong position, you may actually find it convenient to be aligned, right? As of now, and so this is a strategy that many southern countries are adopting now. South Africa in its own ways, they can't break away from their ties with China and Russia. And they know they need to depend on the US for certain things, so they are trying to balance it as well. And so it is essentially, these countries which are rising, not completely there, seems to be a strategy for those countries, in my opinion. And tenable for a while at least.
Then something?
Yeah.
So, the thing is that we members of RICS, we are members of SCO, we are members of Quad, we are members of all these various sort of multilateral groupings, some of which are in diametrically opposite sort of intentions, for whatever better words. So when you, let's say as a member of the SNO, you want to set up an anti-terrorism outfit, whatever it is that you want. At the same time, you also have the Quad, which has a very lot of friction in it, because big members of the SCO, which is China and Russia, how difficult can that be to decide? I mean, it actually meet people from both the sides. How do you sort of?
Well, I would look at it from this perspective, that as far as trade and economic relations are concerned, as Professor Rajagopalan also mentioned, I think you have to maintain relations with everybody on an even keel. And then, of course, there would be pressure to join a particular group in the form of a plurilateral agreement, like the CPTPP or the RCEP, etc. So that is open to you whether to have deeper integration with a set of economies or not. Amen. But we are at the moment, negotiating, for instance, FTAs with the European Union, with the UK. Canada has been put on hold for the moment. RCEP is a closed chapter at the moment, but one doesn't know when it will get open, whether with RCEP or in the form of a negotiation with the CPTPP. And we have also joined the IPEF framework, which has been propagated by the US. So trade, we are, barring China, I think we are maintaining good relations with everyone, even with China. On the surface, it is excellent because China is exporting a lot of things which we require for our industry to keep our wheels moving. So we are doing that. But China is not importing as much as it ought to be doing to keep the trade imbalance under control. Now, trade and economic relations is one thing. When it comes to intelligence sharing, anti-terrorism, I think there is a broad understanding. SCO also doesn't say that, in contradiction to what we have been espousing in other fora about intelligence sharing, about taking concerted action against terrorist organizations all across the globe. Whether the Chinese and the Pakistanis, for instance, in international fora, whether they oppose sanctions, like we have been trying to get sanctions against international terrorists in the UN, and the Chinese have been supporting the Pakistanis in preventing that from happening. But in these plurilateral fora, SCO and the others, there is no difference of opinion. The problem arises in defense matters, pure defense matters. Okay. The Quad is one such example because it is professedly, perhaps not professedly so, but implicitly against China, against China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific and the sense of threat which Japan, Australia and India and the US share, and a lot of other countries are sharing, but it would be difficult for them to articulate that in the open because of their very close economic ties with the Chinese and because of their dependence in a way on China. If you look at the ASEAN countries, many of them have become outsourcing destinations or assembly destinations for the Chinese economic behemoth. So they would not like to, but at the same time, they are also having problems in the South China Sea, for instance, East China Sea, etc. So when it comes to defense matters, sharing, for instance, defense technology, import of weapons, putting up a concerted front, having joint exercises, which we did with the Australians and the Japanese, the Malabar exercise, for instance, therein there is a problem with multi-alignment. I think it brings to mind the recent statement of the US ambassador, I think, if I'm not wrong. He mentioned about a couple of months ago that this concept of strategic autonomy, which is of a piece with multi-alignment, the concept of, he said that, it can only carry on for a short while. Ultimately, you have to pick sides. You can't keep sitting on the fence forever against us. So, for defense purposes, I think it brings it to a sharp focus. You may not be able to do it because things change, of course, with passage of time. But at the moment, we know who are not particularly friendly towards us, who are inimical towards us, and who do not want to see us rise in terms of economic strength, in terms of political influence, and in terms of military powers as well. So we know who are, inimical to us, but in terms of friends, it is always prudent to have as many in the room as your friends, rather than having distant, cold relations with them. Because ultimately, we are living in an integrated, increasingly globalized world. And of course, there is this waning of multilateralism, which is visible in the recent years. But it has not gone out completely. It may make a comeback. So we have to invest in our friendships, in our relationships, and carry on as long as possible without joining a particular alliance, especially a military alliance. Like NATO, for instance. We never joined the SEATO or the CENTO.
Right.
But there may be a time when, our friends, strategic friends, for that matter, we have a strategic friendship with the Americans. So one with comprehensive strategic partnership with the ASEAN also. So at some point of time in future, if things come to a head, we may be called to show our true colors. But that is for the future. There is a very big if attached to it. So till that time, I think, apart from defense matters, and in defense also, I think there is this very important, point which the Americans have, been following. They normally would impose the CATSA sanctions against a country which imported weapons, let's say, from Russia. But for the S-400 system, they have not done it for India. Why? Because the S-400 system is meant to act as a bulwark against the Chinese. And they have a common enemy there. So they would not like our weapons supplies and our, air defense systems to be handicapped, because they are not in a position to supply something very similar or of a similar level of technology to India. So there they have relented. But against Turkey, they made more aggressive noises.
Yes, I know.
The same S-400 system. So I think, it is a question of exploiting the situation to your advantage, looking basically at your national interest, not only in the short-term perspective, but in the medium and longer-term perspective as well, in defense matters.
Dr. Rajagopalan, how important do organizations like the UN become when we talk about multi-alignment?
Plays a role, maybe not in this not in this kind of the specific circumstances that we face or that other countries face. but it has whatever utility it has, but its utility is not in terms of securing our interest. I mean, so that is it's made up of 200 odd nations, and so it's going to be always very chaotic, and and people don't take it seriously enough. Obviously, we didn't take it seriously enough in 71. I mean, the entire UN General Assembly was against us, and we basically told them to take a hike. I mean, so basically, we do what we need to do for our own purposes, for our own interests, and not really in terms of they are not there to serve our interest. It's an association of all the states in the world, most of the states in the world. So it's not really something that is going to be able to coordinate its activities. And we saw even during the Cold War period, with the exception of maybe the first few years after the UN was set up, when the United States basically ran it. But as soon as the Korean War began, from then onwards, the UN has been essentially ineffective because you have the veto power in the Security Council, and Security Council becomes therefore deadlocked, and the General Assembly is too large and cumbersome to do anything other than pass a lot of resolutions that nobody listens to, right? I mean, and so it hasn't really been effective for a very, very long time. I mean, so it's not. I wouldn't really look to the UN for any help when it comes to
help as such. I was thinking about since it is an organization, many members, it could influence certain policies, certain sort of which I don't see happening.
Yeah, it's also because with 200 states there, it's very difficult to find consensus. I mean, we talked about terrorism. I mean, the UN has been debating terrorism for decades without even being able to define what terrorism is. And various other issues with regard to human rights, or even issues of national sovereignty. I mean, whenever it deals with big powers, it's simply incapable of doing anything. And so it's not really possible for the UN, even if on major important issues, given the number of members that it has, and given that all of them have different interests, for them to reach any consensus and be able to do anything very much. So I don't really, I'm somewhat skeptical that the UN's role is not really in that. I mean, to the extent that it provides a forum for everybody to let off steam and maybe occasionally be able to sort of find some
multilateral forums like WTO, economic forum.
Yeah, I mean, obviously some of the functional ones clearly work very well, right? I mean, there are lots of functional organizations that work very effectively and work very quietly in the background. Everything from Telecommunications Union to WTO and so on. WTO obviously has a political aspect to it also, in the sense that there are dispute settlement mechanisms within WTO that can resolve trade disputes. But even there, we have found that to a significant degree, even those trade dispute, the solution is political. Because there are countries that are stronger, there are countries that are weaker, and that does have an effect even on the WTO. Even though at some level one could say that that's purely about economics and purely about trade and whatnot, that's not how it works. I mean, it's not. There is no pure way in which any of these issues can be resolved. I mean, everything from non-tariff barriers or bilateral agreements or subsidies, all of these are issues that are potentially problematic for the WTO to deal with, because countries will disagree with each other about what they're doing and about whether what they're doing is appropriate or not. I mean, so we have disagreement, for example, China, that the ambassador mentioned just now, about China not buying enough from us, whereas we have to buy because we have most of those stuff that we buy are precursors to our own industrial production, and so we can't afford not to buy, being there is no other source for those kinds of precursors. But they also engage in practices that are, and they've done this for decades. I mean, they engage in practices that are unfair, in the sense that both in terms of subsidies, but also in terms of using various barriers or non-trade barriers to sort of prevent us from selling in their market. And they've done other things, stealing technology, stealing, all sorts of. So all of those things that they've done can't be resolved at the WTO because you can make complaints. But they're not going to listen, and so it's going to be a problem. So even on those very, very technical areas, there are problems where so there are not anything that is purely technical, right? So everything ultimately at this level, everything becomes political. Even if it is, for example, IATA says that there is no such thing as Taiwan, and you have to mark it off as Chinese Taipei and whatnot, and so everybody follows because China wants it, and China is a powerful state, and so on and so forth. So even on something that is as technical as IATA, we can't really get a purely non-political, technical sort of decision. Even there, everything is a lot of this is political. So it becomes difficult then to sort of talk about non-political, purely technical, multilateral institutions because they don't exist. They don't exist in the sense that when there is great power conflict that is intensifying.
Dr. Anant, I was just trying to understand that, when you are aligned with two blocks which have conflicting ideas on something, for instance, we've just talking about BRICS. Now, BRICS is trying to offer a separate solution to the dollar, and the Americans are obviously opposed to it. How do you then justify it to the Americans, who are also our strategic partners, that, we are part of the BRICS, but we don't particularly align with this thing, or we do. These are our reasons. How complicated does that become?
Okay, so there are a couple of points to consider in this. One, I think within the BRICS, whatever is happening within the BRICS is between the members, which is a very small grouping still, right? What most countries are wanting to do is to get on to trading in their own currencies. Not all countries, South Africa and Brazil also, along with India, are in favor of a common BRICS currency. So the fears about de-dollarization are a little exaggerated to my understanding. Our own trade is so much in dollars that we are not going to be moving away from that immediately. The other point that is to be noted then is that the whole idea of multi-alignment is that I shouldn't have if Saudi Arabia, which is now in the BRICS, says let's trade in our own currencies, I should be able to do that with Saudi Arabia. But with the US, I will continue dealing with in dollars if that's what is needed. If a sizable number of countries eventually get onto this sort of a system, then you are in a position to say, okay, our system versus your system versus, right? So this is all still going through a phase of negotiations, and it's going to take its time. So my own sense is that it is not all that difficult at this point, like I said. It's an evolving situation, and one needs to bear with it to see where it's going to go,
That's basically what you're saying is that we need to wait and watch and then, align with whatever we think is in our national interest.
Absolutely.
That's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
But I would say that, in addition to this particular point about what do we say to the Americans, to some extent, I think the Americans understand one issue, which is that us being in the BRICS or in the SCO, place like that, is at least partly because we don't want these organizations, these multilateral entities, to be entirely dominated by China. So we in the sense we play a little bit of a spoiler role. So I think they realize and we realize that it is not as if BRICS, the 2000s, yes, maybe BRICS, there was some hope that BRICS could amount to something. I don't think there is any,
any of us they're expanding a lot more. It's even more complicated.
You know that when you expand, that is when you're going to fail, because the more voices at the table, the less likely that there is going to be a single voice, right? And so that expansion itself is indication that this is ultimately, the original objectives of the group of BRICS as a group, as a small, powerful group, is over, right? And so, but I don't think the Americans will have a lot of objections to a lot of, declarations coming out of BRICS, because they know that India is there to make sure that it doesn't do anything too radical. And just as we played that role, even in the non-aligned movement, for example, after in the late 70s and 80s, after Castro's Cuba sort of after Cuba was running the presidency of the NAM for a period of time, which was very radical. And then when India took it over, there was actually a relief in the United States because we were somewhat more moderate. And I think that same sort of expectation is there in the US, but also in India. I think in New Delhi recognizes that this is not that this is, if the Russians and the Chinese get their way, they won't. They don't want to use Indo-Pacific as a term. They don't want Quad. So those are not in our interest.
Right.
So the areas of common interest, therefore, are going to dwindle. There's going to be a lot of declarations and statements, and which is fine. Nobody bothers. And so, that's perfectly fine with the United States. I mean, and same thing with SEO. SEO also, even with the SEO, the terrorism issue. We have Iran in the SEO, which is one of the most active state supporters of terrorism. With who's been, even the UN blamed Iran for Iran or Hezbollah for the killing of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. So there is we all play these games in the sense that for us, when we talk about terrorism, we are not talking about terrorism as some kind of a common issue that has a universal definition. We are talking about terrorism emanating from Pakistan. Right? That is the basic point that you're making. So we are not worried about terrorism from Hamas or Hezbollah or the various things that Iran does.
Right.
So we will invite Iran back, and Iran is a strategic partner and whatnot. So other countries do the same thing, right? So there is states ultimately will follow their national interests, which basically means that there will always be some hypocrisy. There will always be some contradictions. And that is the nature of the beast. There is nothing very much that we can do about it. We can't, honesty is not going to be the primary criteria
I see that all the time.
by which we decide what our positions are going to be in these organizations.
Dr. Dasgupta, you spoke about, RCEP some time back. Do you think this policy about multi-alignment actually has led to us saying that, okay, we won't go into, group sort of groupings and do bilateral economic relations instead? Do you think that's part of this policy?
Well, if you look at the main objections against our joining RCEP, it was basically about the non-transparent methods of subsidization which the Chinese indulge in, and the state support through various means, through banking system, through the public sector, the public enterprises system, etc., which depress prices, make them artificial, and give them an unfair advantage. That was the main thing, and that is the reason why the Americans are also, they have lost interest in the WTO to a great extent because of the way the Chinese have gamed the system. Now, joining RCEP would have meant giving a lot of concessions to the Chinese. We could have phased it out over a period of years, but the thing would have remained the same without honest and sincere commitment and, implementation of being transparent, the Chinese. It wouldn't have been a level playing field. The second point is, very importantly, we already have an economic, comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the ASEAN 10.
Right.
We have now an agreement with the Australians, of course, limited scope, but we are going to expand it. We are negotiating with the New Zealanders. We already have two comprehensive partnership agreements with the Koreans and the Japanese. So out of the whole bunch, apart from China, we have agreements with everybody, or it is in the works.
Right.
So what advantage would we have gained? The whole thing about the ASEAN, and the main criticism for us walking out of the RCEP is coming from the ASEAN. Because the ASEAN has, many of the countries, the leading countries of the ASEAN have become so dependent on China. And the Chinese economy is weighing down on them so much that they want a kind of a release valve. And for that, they were looking for India to provide that release valve so that the excess capacity with the Chinese have built, about which Janet Yellen and the Americans have been talking very openly now, would get into India, the Indian market, rather than throttling whatever relative growth was taking place in the ASEAN countries in terms of manufacturing and providing employment and all the other benefits. So that was the main ASEAN interest, to divert China's, sole focus on the ASEAN, market to India to a great extent. But they are very deeply integrated with the Chinese economy in any case. So I don't think that we are against getting into a grouping, about, for instance, we would like to have an FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has 6 countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others. We already have an agreement with the UAE. We have an agreement in the works with Oman. There are some problems there which we really need to overcome. But GCC would be an ideal kind of an agreement which we would like to get into. And what about the European Union FTA, the ETIA, which we have been negotiating since, unfortunately, 2007. They have 27 countries.
Right.
So there is no ideological problem in getting into an FTA negotiation with a group of countries, however large they may be.
That makes sense.
And we have, for instance, we have a PTA which was signed way back in 2005 with the Mercosur countries. There are 4 of them. And we are wanting to expand that, the scope of that agreement. So there is no problem on that score, I think.
Okay. Before we start the last round of questions, Dr. Rajagopalan, is something that's always bothered me. Do you think this multi-alignment has had any impact at all on the way we seem to have messed up our relationships with our neighbors?
No, I think that is, it's not entirely our fault in the sense that we are 80% of South Asia. Whichever you measure it by population, by geography, by economy, military size, all of that. It's always, irrespective of what we do, our neighbors are always going to be a little bit scared of us and a little bit worried.
It's Big Brother syndrome.
It's there. It's the same thing with Canada or Mexico. They always have this concern about the United States and China, Russia's neighbors vis-a-vis Russia. So the fact that we are so huge automatically means that our neighbors are going to have some concerns, right? And they are going to see the Indian hand, Indian imperialism in everything that happens, irrespective of whether we had anything to do with it or not. There is no doubt that we have made mistakes, and every country makes mistakes, and we have made our own mistakes. But a lot of the problems that we have stems from this huge imbalance of power in the region, and there's nothing that we can do about it. We can't fall apart just to satisfy our neighbors, obviously. So they have always, most of them haven't really had any capacity to do anything about it because nobody else was interested in helping them. The only country that could balance against India was Pakistan, and they did their best. But now, with China being capable of doing that and being interested in doing that, it does mean that some of our neighbors will play that same game that we played with the Soviet Union and the United States, play one off against the other and try to get the best from both sides, right? And we have also been playing that game in the sense that very clearly our deliveries in the neighborhood have improved dramatically, because there was a time when all of our neighbors would constantly complain about the fact that India talks a big game and they say they'll help us with this infrastructure or that airport or this port or whatever else, and then they go back home and then we hear nothing from it, nothing further from it. Whereas now, over the last few years, or the last decade or so, the last decade or more, because of Chinese entry into the region, I think we have become better. Our game has been improved. We are much faster in terms of delivery when it comes to helping our neighbors and so on and so forth. That is a big complaint, and that's improved. So we have kind of recognized that we had to play that game, right? There's no choice in terms of doing that. And we do the same thing vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, China's neighborhood. There, we send occasionally. We have good relations. Our relationships with the region are improving. for a variety of reasons, but one is this, which is that if you play in our neighborhood, we'll play in your neighborhood, right? I mean, so I think that there is no way around the fact that we have now another great power that is actually interested and actually capable of needling us within the neighborhood, and also that our neighbors will take advantage of that. This is all states do that. I mean, so we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that they will do that. We just have to play that game because they don't have any interest. If they align with China, then they lose us. They have no interest in aligning with China. I mean, they have an interest in playing one off against the other. I mean, so that is in a sense what we need to be able to do. And they are going to exploit us, just as we exploited the United States and Soviet Union, and that's just a game, right? I mean, we can't do anything about it. I mean, we just have to let ourselves be exploited, right? I mean, there is nothing. So it's important for us because even if we recognize that they are exploiting us, it's not a huge amount. It's not a huge. It's just that we enhance our relationships better. We are faster on our feet. We are faster in responding to them. We are better in completing projects, and we pay more attention to them, and so on and so forth. So those are the things that we need to do, which we anyway needed to do, which every foreign minister, every prime minister always kept saying, but we never did it because we never had that pressure on us to do. Now we are doing that. So I think it's just a game that we will have to play that game, and as long as China continues to be powerful, we will have competition in the neighborhood. We can't escape that.
Mm-hmm. On that note, we are running out of time, but I'd just like to ask a quick question which will apply, to all of you in one go. Perhaps you could start with that. That on an overall sense, that when we look at, from the time we sort of, decided that we want to be multi-aligned, if you could just sort of outline, where have we gained or where have we lost with that particular policy? Just very briefly that, okay, this has been good, this has been bad. If you could just touch upon certain things for us. So would you like to start?
Sure. Okay, I think the beginnings of multi-alignment, and this is not my research, this is somebody's research that I've read, is somewhere around the mid-2000s. That's where we start, and I think a bit with Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, then Manmohan Singh ji, and downwards. I think that's where the multi-alignment starts. It begins with joining regional groupings of different kinds, starting with ASEAN, look east, etc. Then it also has the element of increasing strategic partnerships with countries. We started it in 1997 with South Africa, and then France, and then now there is much more than 30, close to 40, whatever strategic partnerships. And the third element, which is talked about, is the normative sort of thing that we are trying to do, trying to spread the values that India stands for. Started in a very small way, but it has become big. Grown now with G20, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's almost a high point, I think. So, my sense is that we've gained because a lot of countries, even smaller countries, Southeast Asian countries, are looking to have partners other than, they were looking to have somebody other than the US and China in there. Africans increasingly are viewing it the same way. So, as long as we, as a rising country with substantial experience of being a southern, a global south country, as long as I think we have gained in terms of having our relationships with many of these smaller countries come up really well. With the bigger countries, there are always going to be, the stakes are higher there, so the tensions are going to be higher. So overall, my sense is multi-alignment helps.
Wonderful. Would you agree with that, sir?
I agree by and large with what Dr. Anand has mentioned. See, in terms of, let's say, I just picked 3 areas. One is defense cooperation. We are buying a lot of arms now from the Americans. We are buying a lot from the Russians. We are also exporting now to many countries, which we were not doing earlier.
Yes.
And what is more important is that we have co-production facilities with the Russians, for instance. Increasingly, we are, for instance, making this AK-203 apart from the aircraft, big aircraft, which we are using. With the Americans also, we are going to have similar arrangements. And with Rafael, of course, it was offset policy was in operation, but it didn't really work, to my knowledge. So we are this multi-alignment has allowed us in defense matters to pick the best weapons systems that we wanted. In terms of economic and trade relations, I think our multi-alignment policy has allowed us to have relations with the Gulf, with ASEAN, with the Americans, the Europeans, and the Chinese, increase our trade presence. And wherever we have found an advantage, we have been importing. China is our biggest source of imports. So that also has helped us. As far as this. The last issue is about not belonging to a particular group. We have imported a huge amount of oil from the Russians after the Crimean crisis also. And that the Americans have turned kind of an indulgent eye towards that, and because it works to their advantage and to the Europeans' advantage as well. So I don't think we have really lost out on anything by our policy of multi-alignment. And I must end with one of my views, which is that only when you are near the top as a major power and you are trying to get a large number of other countries to follow your lead and to have, as the Americans call it, regulatory coherence, which means that you bring your systems in conformity with mine. Till the time that we attain such heights, we can continue with our policy of multi-alignment. Only when that takes place, when in future, 2047 or earlier or later, we achieve that height, then you will have to, really take sides perhaps and align with one or the other of the major powers at that point of time.
Mm-hmm. How far are we from that state?
I think we are a long, long way away from becoming a developed country with a per capita income of about $2,700 per annum. We are, and there are various estimates which say that unless you have the range of $25,000 to $30,000, and there are other criteria which say that you are a middle-income country. The Chinese are still, or despite having a per capita income of $13,000, still not a developed country by many standards. So the benchmarks vary, but we are, I think, a long way off from becoming a developed country. And unless we, of course, I am digressing, unless we educate our people, the young people, properly, primary education, secondary education, we provide them with good health care so that they are productive individuals who are also using all their faculties. I think we will not be able to aim at goal of becoming a developed country in the short run. So, we have to concentrate on the basics and investment in science and technology, scientific temper, research and development. That is the only thing which will take our country forward.
And I couldn't agree with you more, but
yeah, I think multi-alignment works as long as it works. The problem is that it's all fair weather. It's a fair weather policy, right? In the sense that when things are going your way, or when things are when you are not facing any danger, that's fine. You can be friends with. I mean, as Dr. Anand mentioned, we have, I don't know, I've forgotten to count how many strategic partnerships we have, as something around 30 or whatever. It's become somewhat meaningless. The only two really important countries that matter, I mean, three, maybe if you feel to Russia also, but US and China. I mean, so that is, it's basically when you're talking about multi-alignment, it doesn't really matter whether we are partnering with Thailand or with even Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are the ones that matter because that matters for our security, right? I mean, and so, and the problem with having kind of foot in all camps approach is that when we face, if we do end up facing a problem, then it may be too late, right? In the sense that this is what happened in 62, right? In the sense that there had been an informal sort of a security, guarantee may be too strong a word, but a security consideration that the United States has given to India, but we did not really want a partnership. And so when the time came for, when the push came to shove, it was very difficult to actually do anything at that stage, right? I mean, and so, even if you look at Kargil, for example, or any other recent crisis that we've had, we are always running to look for resupplies or things of that kind at the last minute, and it's very difficult to do it at that stage after a crisis broke. So so we are doing some things we are doing now which might help stave that off, but only by violating this rule about multi-alignment, which is intelligence cooperation, things like that. And we get a lot of stuff from the US with regard to movement of Chinese forces and things of that kind that we know about. So that is what part. I mean, but if we do not have if we do not have a crisis with China, fine, this all works, no problem. But if we do have a crisis with China, and if we do need assistance, then it doesn't matter how many naval exercises we have held, how many Malabar exercises we have held, it's not going to be enough, right? I mean, because even coordinating, thinking of, for example, what are the kind of equipment that we might potentially need in a crisis, right? I mean, we are finding out in Ukraine that what was needed is artillery shells, which nobody really paid much attention to. And we are finding that a lot of high-tech American equipment, they don't have enough in quantity. So there's a lot of problems with regard to the way they considered future war. And so those kinds of problems can't be resolved overnight. That requires a lot more coordination. And my fear is that coordination is happening now beyond the Quad. That is, the Quad is being sidelined. So the AUKUS, the Australia-Japan partnership, the Japan-South Korean partnership. So they're all moving towards a much more hardcore military coordination, right, where they have forces in each other's countries. They are, interoperability is increasing. And we are kind of not comfortable with that, but at some stage it might potentially be dangerous. So I think as a fair weather policy, this works well. But if something happens, where then we might potentially pay a price.
Right. On that note, I'm sorry we have run out of time. I really want to thank all of you for a really stimulating conversation, because I learned a lot out of this whole thing. Thank you so much, Dr. Anand, Dr. Dasgupta, Dr. Rajagopalan. Thank you. That were three really stellar individuals that, who explained to us today what the pros and cons of multi-alignment mean for India. I do hope you enjoyed this roundtable as much as I enjoyed speaking to the panelists today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Dasgupta signing out.